Tamara Jones entered the courtroom with a quiet confidence that many admired. She was known in town for her calm demeanor and ability to navigate the complexities of local politics. Even though this wasn't her first time in a courtroom, today felt different. She wasn't there on official counsel business, but rather to handle a minor matter. She had been in a rush earlier in the morning, on her way to a meeting when she'd been stopped by an officer for what seemed like a simple infraction at the time, a small mistake no one would have thought much of, but now here she was standing before Judge Robert Williams, a man who had served in this position for many years and who had earned a reputation for being stern quick to impose his decisions on all who came before him. Tamara looked around the crowded room filled with a mixture of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Some people looked on with indifference, while others whispered to each other out of curiosity. The judge sat high on his platform, his face unmoving as he reviewed the documents before him. Tamara stood calmly at the center of the room, feeling the eyes of everyone on her. Although she was no stranger to attention, something about this moment felt different. Perhaps it was the way the judge was looking at her, as if already knowing her fate had been sealed. He glanced up from his papers for a moment, and Tamara met his gaze without flinching, but there was a subtle discomfort in the air. Without hesitation, Judge Williams began speaking, his voice carrying authority. As he addressed her without waiting for much explanation, he laid down a fine that seemed far harsher than she had expected. She knew her error was small, and yet the fine reflected a decision that seemed swift and without room for understanding. It wasn't a typical outcome for someone who had never been in trouble before. In fact, Tamara had made a point of staying out of legal matters for years. As an elected official, she had worked tirelessly to maintain her reputation in the community. This small mishap was a simple mistake, and yet it seemed to have become something much bigger in that moment. She stood still, absorbing the words, but not reacting too quickly. A quiet tension filled the room as the judge's words echoed in her mind. How quickly he had dismissed her, how easily he had handed down a penalty without any real consideration for who she was or what she had done. But Tamara kept her composure. She had learned long ago how to keep her emotions in check in public situations, and this was no different. She simply nodded, acknowledging the fine before she turned and began to leave the courtroom. As she walked out of the room, she caught the gaze of a few familiar faces in the crowd, but none of them spoke. They only watched her quietly. Some seemed uncomfortable, others confused, but all seemed to understand something wasn't quite right about how this had unfolded. Tamara's steps were deliberate and calm, but inside her mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. She had been treated like just another citizen, someone who had no influence, no importance. But she knew that wasn't true. She had earned her place as a councilwoman, and in that moment, it felt as if that status had been completely disregarded, as if it didn't matter at all. She left the courthouse without making a scene, but the seed of unease had been planted. She knew this wouldn't be the end of it. She could feel the storm building, even if no one else could yet see it brewing. As Tamara stepped out of the courthouse, her mind was still reeling from the judge's decision. The sting of the fine lingered, but there was something else that troubled her, a deeper unease that she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the fine itself, but the way it had been handed down so quickly, so without thought. It was as though the judge hadn't even seen her, or perhaps he had seen her, but chose to disregard who she really was. But she couldn't dwell on it. Now she had a meeting to attend, and her responsibilities as a councilwoman were waiting for her. The drive to the meeting was quiet, but the radio seemed too loud, as if trying to fill a silence that had become unbearable. Tamara's thoughts raced, but she kept her focus. She couldn't let this affect her work. She had too many people relying on her. But as she drove through the streets of the town, she couldn't help but noticed the stares from some of the people. She passed a few, waved politely. Others just watched her with uncertain eyes. She wondered how many had been in the courtroom earlier, how many knew what had happened, how many would start talking about it later. By the time she reached the meeting, her thoughts had settled into a quiet resolve. She walked in with the same confidence she always carried. Her colleagues greeted her with smiles and handshakes, but there was a slight hesitation in their greetings, as if they knew something was off. But no one mentioned it. They sat down and began discussing the day's agenda, but Tamara's mind was somewhere else. She tried to concentrate on the issues at hand, but every few moments her thoughts drifted back to the courthouse, to Judge Williams, and the unfairness of it all. It wasn't until later that afternoon that the first phone call came. It was from a close friend who worked at a local news station. She sounded concerned, and rightfully so. Word had gotten out about the fine, and the story was already starting to spread across social media. People were talking, people were asking questions. Tamara felt her stomach drop as she listened to her friend recount the details. It was clear the story was taking on a life of its own. It wasn't just about a simple fine anymore. It was becoming something much bigger, something that reached beyond her and the courthouse and into the very fabric of the community. As the day wore on, the news coverage intensified and the story took on a new angle. Local reporters began to question how someone as well known as Tamara could be treated like any other citizen, as if she didn't hold an important position within the community. The implications of the fine began to hit home for many people who had always admired Tamara for her leadership and poise. They were now questioning how the system treated her and why she had been so quickly dismissed in that courtroom. But it wasn't just the media that began to stir. It was the people of the town, too. The whispers in cafes, the debates on street corners, the uncertain glances exchanged between neighbors. Tamara's phone started to buzz with messages from friends and colleagues, some offering support, others asking her what had happened. She kept the same composed tone in her responses, but inside she was unraveling a little more with each new call. Meanwhile, Judge Williams sat in his office, staring at the case file in front of him, but something didn't feel right as he reread the details of the fine. Something about the woman's name lingered in his mind. He had seen her before, he had known her face, he had seen her at town events, at council meetings, at public forums. But it had all slipped his mind. In that moment in the courtroom, his heart began to race as the truth hit him hard. The woman he had just fined wasn't just another member of the community. She was the newly elected city councilwoman Tamara Jones. Judge Williams sat at his desk, staring blankly at the case file in front of him. His mind was still buzzing with the realization that he had made a grave mistake. He couldn't quite understand how it had happened, how he had missed something so obvious. But as the truth settled in his stomach, churned with unease, he had just fined Tamara Jones, the newly elected city councilwoman, and yet he had treated her like any other person in the courtroom, with no regard for her status or her significance in the community. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as his thoughts raced. Was it his bias that had led to the quick decision? Was it his failure to recognize her face among the many others who passed through the courtroom every day? He had prided himself on being fair and impartial, but now doubt crept in. Was this the result of an unspoken prejudice, something that had always lingered just beneath the surface, but never quite surfaced until now? The more he thought about it, the worse it seemed. His mind replayed the scene from earlier that morning, Tamara standing before him, calm and composed, her eyes steady, as he handed down the fine without a second thought. He hadn't even asked her any questions, hadn't given her a chance to explain herself fully. All he had seen was a name on a paper and made a snap judgment. The realization was like a punch to the gut. He wasn't sure what to do next. Should he call her and apologize? Should he let it go and hope the matter would fade away? He knew that wouldn't work. The fine had already made waves across the town, and the media was picking up on it. People were talking and asking questions, and now the judge was at the center of a storm of his own making. Meanwhile, Tamara was facing her own storm back at her office. Her phone had barely stopped ringing with calls and messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. She had always been an advocate for fairness and equality, but now she found herself in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. People who had once admired her for her leadership were now questioning how she had been treated in that courtroom. How could she be so easily dismissed without anyone recognizing her for who she was? Her face and her position were supposed to matter, but in that moment they hadn't. At first she had kept her calm, but now that the media was involved and the public was beginning to take notice, she couldn't stay silent for much longer. She had worked too hard to get to where she was. To let this moment define her, she had to speak out. But she knew she couldn't do it rashly. She had to make sure her words were measured and clear. The town was already divided, some supporting the judge and his decision, while others rallied behind Tamara, demanding justice. She had expected this. She knew the town wasn't without its divisions. But what she hadn't expected was how deeply the incident would shake her own sense of self. She had always believed that her role as a councilwoman gave her a voice that would be heard, But now she realized that wasn't always the case. She had been overlooked in the very place where she should have been recognized and respected. As the day wore on, the pressure mounted. Tamara knew it was only a matter of time before she would have to address the public. But what could she say? She couldn't undo what had already happened, but she could make sure her message was clear. This wasn't just about a fine, this was about something deeper, something more important. The story of Tamara Jones and the judge's fine spread like wildfire across the town as news outlets began to pick up the story. The headlines quickly turned sensational. People who had never paid much attention to local politics were suddenly talking about the city councilwoman who had been treated so unfairly by the court. The public's reaction was swift and divided as the story made its rounds through social media and the local news stations. The controversy started to take on a life of its own. Some people were outraged by what had happened to Tamara. They saw her as a symbol of the ongoing fight for equality and fairness in a system that seemed to disregard the worth of Black leaders in their own community. Others, however, took a different view. They believed that Tamara had simply made a mistake like anyone else, and that the judge had done his job by issuing the fine. They argued that no one should be above the law regardless of their position in society. But Tamara knew this wasn't just about the fine, it was about how she had been treated by the system, how her very identity had been overlooked, as if her work, her role in the community didn't matter. As the debate grew fiercer and the town became increasingly polarized, Tamara found herself at the center of the storm. In one corner were her supporters, people who had always backed her and who now saw this incident as an example of the deep-rooted issues within the justice system. They believed that the treatment she received was a reflection of something much larger and more systemic than just a single decision in a courtroom. On the other hand, were those who believed that the judge had simply acted within his authority and that the fine was warranted regardless of Tamara's position as an elected official. Tamara watched the conversations unfold with a mixture of disbelief and sadness. She had expected some backlash, but the level of division took her by surprise. It was clear to her now that this wasn't just about her, it was about the way the town viewed race, power, and authority, and how easily a person could be dismissed if they weren't seen as fitting into a specific mold. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the fine wasn't the real issue. The real issue was the way people saw her and the way they saw her role in the town as a Black woman in politics. She had often felt like an outsider despite her accomplishments, despite the trust that had been placed in her by the people who had elected her. Her phone buzzed again. It was another message, this time from a friend who worked at a local newspaper. She said the story was getting traction and that some people were already calling for an investigation into the judge's conduct. This was spiraling faster than Tamara had anticipated. She wasn't sure whether to feel grateful for the support or overwhelmed by the attention. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let this moment define her. She couldn't let it destroy all the work she had done for the town. By the time the evening news aired, the debate had only grown louder. Tamara's supporters had begun organizing rallies and peaceful protests, while others continued to defend the judge's actions. The tension was palpable in the town. The conversations on the street had become charged and heated, with many people on both sides of the issue unwilling to back down. In the midst of all the chaos, Judge Williams sat in his office reflecting on everything that had transpired since the hearing. He had heard the news and seen the growing public reaction. He felt trapped between his own conscience and the mounting pressure to stay neutral. But now he couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right decision, if he had acted rashly in that moment, and whether it was time for him to confront his own biases head-on. The pressure on Judge Williams was mounting with each passing hour. The town was divided like never before, and it seemed the controversy surrounding his decision was only intensifying. The media attention was relentless. Local reporters swarmed the courthouse, demanding answers from anyone who would speak, but the judge remained silent, trying to avoid the chaos that had already consumed his life. He had issued his public apology earlier that morning, but now he realized it hadn't been enough. It hadn't been sincere enough. It had been too rushed, too rehearsed, and too devoid of real understanding. Judge Williams sat in his office staring at the stack of paperwork before him, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop replaying the scene in the courtroom over and over in his head. Why hadn't he recognized Tamara? He had seen her at town meetings at events, but when she stood before him that day, all he saw was a name on a paper. He hadn't taken the time to ask her anything or even acknowledge who she was as a person, as a leader in the community. He had acted quickly and without thought, and now the consequences were unfolding around him. But as the days passed and the town continued to erupt in debate, something in Judge Williams began to shift. It wasn't just the pressure of the public that weighed on him. It was the quiet, gnawing realization that he had made a mistake far greater than a simple legal error. He had failed to see beyond his own assumptions, his own biases. He hadn't given Tamara the respect she deserved as an elected official, and that failure had repercussions not just for her, but for the entire town. Meanwhile, Tamara was grappling with her own emotions. As the days dragged on, she had received an outpouring of support from her community, people who were outraged by the judge's actions and who saw the incident as a blatant example of racial injustice. But the support wasn't without its complications. It had opened up wounds that she had been trying to heal for years. It forced her to confront the reality that even in her position as an elected official, she was still seen through the lens of prejudice and assumption. Tamara spent her evenings at home with her family trying to stay grounded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would define her whether she liked it or not. She couldn't let herself be a passive bystander in her own story. She needed to take control of the narrative. She knew that if she didn't speak out and set the record straight, others would continue to define her for her. And so she began to write. The statement came together slowly, but with conviction. She spoke not just for herself, but for every person who had ever felt overlooked or dismissed by a system meant to protect them. She wrote about the implications of what had happened to her, about the way she had been treated, and about the larger issue of racial bias that still ran deep in the town. She wrote with the kind of clarity and strength that she had learned to carry as an elected official and as a Black woman in a world that often overlooked both. When she released the statement to the media, it was more than just a response to the fine. It was a call to action, a plea for the town to confront its own biases and to take a hard look at how it treated its leaders and its people. She wasn't looking for sympathy or retribution. She was calling for accountability and for a change in how people view each other. The reaction to her statement was swift and powerful. The town was split, but Tamara's message resonated with many who had been silently watching from the sidelines. They recognized the importance of her words and began to rally behind her. There was no turning back now. The town had been forced to confront its own truths, and the conversation had only just begun. Tamara's statement rippled through the town like a stone thrown into a calm pond. People were talking, some with anger, others with a sense of relief, but most were still grappling with the truth of what she had said. The town had been forced to confront something it had always danced around: the systemic biases that existed not only in the courthouse, but in every corner of their community. The media coverage intensified, and while many rallied behind Tamara, there were others who felt uncomfortable with her bold words. Some believed she was using the incident to fuel division, while others saw it as a much-needed call for a more just and equal system. As the debates raged on, Tamara knew one thing: she had to stay true to herself. In the following days, her schedule became a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and discussions. Everywhere she went, people approached her, some with praise, others with criticism, but all with a desire to have their voices heard. Tamara was no stranger to public attention, but this felt different. This wasn't just about policy or city planning. It was about something deeper, something that affected every aspect of her life and the lives of countless others. The town hall meeting, scheduled for the following week, became the focal point of the ongoing conversation. It was clear that this would not just be a routine gathering. People were coming to voice their opinions, to question the justice system, and to demand change. Tamara had prepared herself for this moment. She had been in local politics long enough to know how important it was to give people the space to speak, to listen to their frustrations, and to guide them toward finding solutions. But even she wasn't prepared for the emotional charge that filled the room that night. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the town's citizens filed in, each person carrying their own perspective and feelings about the incident. Tamara took her seat at the front, flanked by her colleagues. She noticed Judge Williams sitting near the back of the room, his face as tense as everyone else's. It was clear that the moment had arrived for both of them to address the people who were watching and waiting. The first speaker was a community activist, someone who had spent years advocating for racial equality in the town. She spoke passionately about the incident, about how it wasn't just about Tamara's fine, but about the larger issue of racial injustice that ran deep in the system. She demanded an apology from the judge and a public reckoning with the town's history of inequality. Her words sparked a round of applause, but there was no mistaking the discomfort on Judge Williams' face. One by one, more people took the mic, some of them staunch defenders of the judge, others who shared Tamara's concerns about the lack of accountability in the system. Tamara listened quietly, her mind racing as she considered how to respond. She had prepared a speech, but in this moment, she realized she needed to speak from the heart. When it was her turn, she stood slowly, taking a deep breath before addressing the crowd. "I'm not here to point fingers," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm here to say that we all have work to do. This is about more than one person's mistake. It's about the way we treat each other, about the way we see each other. We've all been complicit in allowing biases to dictate how we treat people, how we make decisions, how we think about race and power." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in days, there was silence in the room. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I'm asking you, all of you, to help me change that. This isn't just my fight, it's all of ours." As she sat back down, she could feel the weight of the moment. She had opened a door, but it was up to the town to walk through it. Whether they would or not was still uncertain, but Tamara was resolved to keep pushing, to keep challenging the system. This was just the beginning. The town hall meeting continued late into the evening, the energy in the room shifting with each passing moment. Tamara's words had opened a floodgate of emotions, and now there was no turning back. The conversations that followed were raw and real. Residents spoke of their own experiences with bias, both big and small, and shared how those experiences had shaped their lives. Some had felt the sting of injustice for years, while others had never considered how their actions or assumptions might contribute to the problem. Judge Williams, though quiet and still at the back of the room, seemed to absorb the weight of it all. He didn't speak that night, but it was clear that the flood of voices had affected him deeply. His earlier apologies had been formal, detached almost, but tonight, the conversations in the room painted a picture he couldn't ignore. Tamara watched him, noting the subtle shifts in his demeanor as he listened. His face, once hard and unwavering, now looked almost weary, as if the weight of his decisions was beginning to settle in. This was what she had hoped for, a reckoning. It wasn't just about the fine, it was about creating space for everyone to be heard and to reckon with their own biases. The meeting stretched into hours, but by the time it came to a close, there was a shift in the air. Something had been unlocked. The seeds of change were planted, but it was clear to Tamara that this was only the beginning of a much longer journey. As the crowd began to disperse, people gathered in small groups, discussing what had just transpired. Some were visibly shaken, while others felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tamara stood in the middle of it all, thanking the people who had spoken, shaking hands with those who had come to offer support. But there was still a heaviness in her chest. The work was far from over. The next day, the media coverage intensified. News outlets from all over the region were reporting on the town hall meeting, focusing on the deep conversations that had unfolded. Headlines began to shift, no longer focusing solely on the fine and its aftermath, but on the larger issue of racial bias in the town. Tamara's words had set the tone for a bigger conversation, and now the community couldn't ignore the problem any longer. While some of the town still resisted change, the voices of those who were pushing for equality grew louder. The judge, despite his initial hesitance, found himself facing mounting pressure to address the issue more sincerely. Calls for an official apology from him were flooding in from local activists and residents alike. Even some of his colleagues in the judicial system quietly encouraged him to confront his actions with more transparency. Tamara knew it would take time, but the momentum had shifted in her favor. The town was waking up. Conversations were happening, hard, uncomfortable conversations, but they were happening, and that was the first step toward real change. As the days passed, she continued to lead, her resolve growing stronger with each passing hour. She received messages of encouragement from across the nation, but it was the messages from the local community that kept her grounded. From her neighbors to local students who admired her for standing up, Tamara realized that this was bigger than her. This was about giving a voice to those who had been silenced for far too long. Judge Williams, too, was facing the aftermath of the event. As the pressure continued to build, he found himself in difficult discussions with his colleagues, slowly coming to terms with the role he had played in perpetuating the very biases that Tamara had called out. He had issued his apology, but the words now felt hollow compared to the larger work that lay ahead. For both Tamara and the judge, the journey was only beginning. The town, once divided, was now at a crossroads, and only time would tell which direction it would take. The days that followed the town hall meeting were filled with a mix of tension, hope, and uncertainty. The conversation had shifted, but whether real change would come depended on the choices that were made in the coming weeks. Tamara stood resolute, knowing that she had started something significant, but fully aware that the work had only just begun. The voices of those who had spoken up at the meeting, those who had felt silence for so long, needed to be heard, and their demands for fairness and equality had to lead to action, not just words. Judge Williams, too, was finding himself in a position of reflection. He spent many quiet nights thinking about what had transpired, reconsidering his approach, and asking himself hard questions about the assumptions he had carried with him for so long. He had spent his career priding himself on objectivity, but now he saw how easily his judgment had been clouded by unconscious bias. He couldn't undo the past, but he realized he could learn from it, and that was the first step toward growth. Tamara's phone rang one morning, and it was an invitation she had not expected. The local bar association, in response to the public outcry, had decided to host a meeting where both she and Judge Williams would be present to discuss the incident, its implications, and what steps could be taken to rebuild trust between the justice system and the community. It wasn't a decision that came easily for everyone involved, but the town's leaders recognized that something had to change. Tamara had mixed feelings about the meeting. She knew it was a crucial opportunity to bring about change, but it also felt daunting. The eyes of the community were on her, and her words could either advance or hinder the progress they had made so far. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future of the town, and for all the people who had been marginalized and overlooked for so long. On the day of the meeting, the room was packed with attorneys, community leaders, activists, and reporters. Tamara arrived early, sitting quietly in the back of the room to gather her thoughts. She saw Judge Williams enter a few minutes later, his face drawn, but resolute. He took a seat at the front, and the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew that this meeting was about more than just an apology. It was about acknowledging the deep-rooted issues within the system and beginning the long process of change. When the meeting finally began, Tamara spoke first. Her voice was calm but strong as she addressed the room. She didn't sugarcoat the problem. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure of the system to see me as a person, to see me as a leader in this community, she said. And that's the issue. It's not just about one bad judgment. It's about a system that allows people like me to be overlooked, to be dismissed. The room was silent as she spoke, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Tamara continued, outlining the need for anti-bias training, for reform within the judicial system, and for a commitment to make the town a place where all voices were heard, respected, and treated equally. When it was Judge Williams' turn to speak, there was a noticeable shift. His usual confidence was absent, replaced by a sense of vulnerability. He began by acknowledging his failure. I didn't see Tamara for who she was that day, and in doing so, I failed not just her, but this entire community, he admitted. I cannot undo what happened, but I promise you that I will work tirelessly to ensure that this never happens again. The room responded with a mix of cautious optimism and still simmering skepticism. But Tamara recognized that this moment was a pivotal one. It wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of something larger. Over the next few months, the town began to implement changes. Judge Williams committed to attending anti-bias training, and the local judicial system began to incorporate policies aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. Tamara's role in this process was far from over. She continued to be a vocal advocate for systemic change, but now she did so with a greater sense of purpose. The town had changed, and while there was still much work to be done, Tamara knew that the conversation she had started was one that would echo for years to come. And in the end, it wasn't just the judge who had been transformed. The entire town had been forced to reckon with its past and reimagine its future. And that, Tamara knew, was the first step toward true justice.